A new poll is out showing a majority of Americans approve of how President-elect Donald Trump is handling his transition. It also gauges how Americans are feeling about some of his cabinet picks. The CBS YouGov poll found that 47% of people who are familiar with the candidates think that RFK Jr. is a good choice to lead the Department of Health and Human Services. That's a better showing than Pete Hegseth for Defense Secretary, Tulsi Gabbard for Director of National Intelligence, and even Marco Rubio for Secretary of State. And Marco Rubio, not seen as a controversial choice. The idea of such a vocal vaccine cynic leading the country's public health department has alarmed many in the medical community who spent their careers in public health. It also worries people who have covered Kennedy's anti-vax advocacy for years. Joining us now is Brian Deer, an investigative reporter who has covered the anti-vaccine movement for more than 3 decades. He's also the author of The Doctor Who Fooled the World, Science, Deception, and the War on Vaccines. Brian, thank you so much. You wrote an op-ed in the New York Times, and it was titled, "I'll Never Forget What Kennedy Did During Samoa's Measles Outbreak." And you wrote in there, the consequences of his views and those in his orbit are not merely absurd, but tragic. What is it about the measles outbreak in Samoa that you think is so important when it comes to RFK Jr. for people to consider?
Well, firstly, the important thing to understand is that year 2019 was a measles year, and there was a tremendous amount of measles around the world. And that was encouraged by Mr. Kennedy and his supporters at the time, who were trying to promote fear of vaccines with suggestions that somehow American scientists weren't playing it straight. So there's that aspect to it. And the way the measles virus then got to Samoa was by a transition through New Zealand, Auckland, where there'd been the worst measles outbreak in decades. The virus then got on a plane and got into the Pacific Islands of Samoa, where it caused the deaths of 80 people, overwhelmingly small children. And the thing that really moved me was spending a great deal of time, I think almost a whole week of the time I was there, simply talking to the parents of children who had died. And it was a deeply, deeply shocking experience, because here was an example where you could see very, very clearly the fact that vaccination levels had fallen and the disease just exploited that opportunity. It was like a natural experiment, if you like, of what would happen if measles vaccination wasn't taking place in America or anywhere else.
RFK Jr. insists that he's not anti-vaccine. On the day after the election, he said that if vaccines are working for someone, that he was not going to take them away. Also, though, last year, he said very clearly in a podcast, no vaccine is safe and effective. In all of your reporting, do you have a handle on what RFK really believes here?
Yes, I do. He always prefaces his remarks when he's speaking to his supporters by saying, "I am not anti-vaccine. I am not anti-vaccine. I am pro-vaccine." But there was one occasion where he was speaking in Ohio at a farm which wasn't a meeting advertised to the general public. You had to get special permission to go, where he said exactly what he means by a vaccine. And he said his 3-point criteria for a vaccine would be: you get one shot, you get lifetime immunity. Secondly, the side effects are 1 in a million. And the third thing is, he says, herd immunity is 70%. In other words, 70% of the population is protected, so nobody ever gets the disease again. And then he finished those remarks to his supporters in private. He said, if they came up with that product, I'd be happy to take a look at it. That's what Robert Kennedy thinks about vaccines. He sets criteria that could never be met by any vaccine, and nobody has ever said that it has been.
Yeah, and science doesn't support that it's needed when we're looking at herd immunity. I mean, just look at what the measles vaccine has done to measles and the polio vaccine. I mean, logic and history show that vaccines work. And since he has entered Donald Trump's orbit, Brian, RFK, we've seen him trying to shift his focus from talking about vaccines to talking and focusing on chronic diseases like obesity. And he's also made clear that he is not a fan of the now very popular weight loss drugs like Ozempic. He told Fox News that the drug maker was counting on the drug maker was counting on selling it to Americans because we are so stupid and so addicted to drugs, also offering this as a solution. Let me play this for you.
If we spent about 1/5 of that giving good food, 3 meals a day to every man, woman, and child in our country, we could solve the obesity and diabetes epidemic overnight.
Add it all together, Brian, what do you think senators who are going to be vetting and considering his nomination, what should they be asking him, given your history and knowledge of his claims?
I think people need to go back into the historical record, and presumably the Democrats will find stuff from Mr. Kennedy's past, which will expose really what he's all about. He's not a man who's campaigned against sugar or against smoking or against other things like alcohol, things that we know affect people's health. He's consistently been an anti-vaccine campaigner going back now for a long, long time, at least 20 years. He's been an anti-vax campaigner, and that's really what he's interested in. So any questions which really look deeply into his real views and his real activity, and also the fact that he cannot be relied on to tell the truth. I've found time and again people coming forward and saying, well, I was talking to Robert Kennedy and he said this, and they come out with the most fantastic stuff. One, for example, was Louis Farrakhan, who Mr. Kennedy formed an alliance with. Louis Farrakhan of the Nation of Islam took from his conversation with Mr. Kennedy that the CDC was biologically and genetically altering vaccines in order to kill Black and Latino boys. He spoke with Howard Lutnick the other week, and Howard Lutnick said he'd spent 2.5 hours with Mr. Kennedy, and he came away with the idea again that children were being injured, that autism was linked to vaccines, and the same old Kennedy story. And the information he puts out is simply not right.
If you want to know much more and the long and honest history of that fraudulent claim about a link between vaccines and autism, I suggest everyone read your book and look at your reporting over the decades. Thank you so much, Brian Deere. Really appreciate your time. Thank you so much. John.